Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We go to Adam Kinzinger of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. A lot has changed for both of us since we sat next to each other on the Energy and Commerce Committee. You went and ran the CIA, and now you're Secretary of State, and I grew a beard. So it's been a pretty interesting little bit of time. I just want to say a couple of quick things. I think it's important to note the good work Colombia has done in the Venezuelan crisis in terms of housing 700,000 people that have crossed their border, 152,000 vaccines, and 23,000 children in part of this crisis. Just a couple of points before I get into my questions. First off, there's a lot of discussion about Russia and about the Libyan model. Firstly, on Russia, I think it's important to note that this administration, and I think through your continued leadership we'll continue to see it, has been one of the most aggressive administrations against Russia that we have seen in modern times. Everything from pushing back to them in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, and everywhere else. And I think that's important to note. We don't have to talk about everything that's being done all the time in order to say this has been the most effective administration for pushing back against that, not to mention energy development, et cetera. And on the Libyan, we're bringing that up a lot, and I get it. We all know what the point, when it was mentioned the Libya model, the point was get rid of all your nukes. To push that into when Gaddafi was stabbed in the back of a pickup truck is not appropriate. Look, you oppress your people, you attack your people, they're going to rise up and take you out. It has nothing to do with the denuclearization of Libya. So I think that's important to note. But I do want to ask you, as my colleague had started to talk a little bit about Syria, I believe that with the existence of Assad and that oppressive regime, it actually creates a cauldron for the recruiting of ISIS or the next generation of ISIS or the next al-Qaeda. And so I think staying engaged in Syria is essential to preventing that from happening in future generations. Mr. Secretary, from your perspective, what would be a successful outcome militarily and politically in Syria? And I know that's a difficult question because it's a very difficult conflict.
It is difficult especially to do in a short time. Our mission statement is pretty clear, at least the near-term mission statement is pretty clear, right? It's to continue, from State Department's perspective, to continue to support the Secretary of Defense's efforts to defeat ISIS, to provide the diplomatic space for them to achieve that so they don't have threats around them. Second, to work to de-escalate the violence so that we can set some conditions for returnees. There have been a handful, right? We're seeing this a little bit in Iraq. We hope to be able to set conditions where we can achieve that in Syria, although there is an awful lot of work left to do. I can walk pocket by pocket in the north. I'll meet with my Turkish counterpart next week with the expectation that we will walk out of there with a plan for how we don't have two NATO partners at each other in that space. And in the southwest, we see what happens when Iran continues to advance, right? The Israelis are going to do what they need to do to defend themselves. And so there's an important diplomatic role there for us as well, to work with the handful of willing partners we have in Syria to create the conditions to first take down the islands so that the Syrian people have a chance. And I'll concede this is aspirational, one for that seems difficult to see today, but have a chance to create conditions for themselves which aren't the desperate ones in which they've been living for these past too many years.
Thank you, and I know it's an issue you're passionate about, and I want to echo what Mr. Boyle said about the $200 million in aid. You answered that question, so I won't hammer on that, but I'm very concerned with what I've seen, including the freezing of $300,000 for the IIM, which is investigating war crimes. I think we have an obligation as a country to prosecute and push back against war crimes, and so I would hope that part of that review, that money is released. I do want to shift briefly to the issue of Russia. You served on you obviously understand energy issues as well as foreign policy issues. Can you talk about the nexus between our ability to push back Russian influence in Europe and the development of European energy, our exports, et cetera, and how that plays together and what we can do to actually strengthen our hand there?
So, Representative Kinzinger, this slightly simplifies it, but to the extent that Europeans are dependent or reliant upon Russian energy, it makes their freedom of movement in pushing back against Russia more limited. And it's a little more complex than that, but is a true statement at its core. We have the opportunity, the real opportunity, to decouple them from Russia across many dimensions, coming out of lots of the Caucasus, lots of different parts that can deliver this energy. America ought to be part of that. We should continue to push the Nord Stream 2 to be ended. We should not increase the dependence that Europe has on Russian energy, And if we can achieve those things, we will put Europe on a much more sound footing. So if there's a day where there is a crisis, where there's a real challenge, and Russia decides to use that tool to advance its interests, that there are substitutes or capacity that power that the Russians want to have won't exist.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. I yield back.
Norma Torres of California.